Okay, welcome back to the online logic certification class for Pyramind. And we're getting into chunk 3 now, which is recording and editing MIDI. It's a whole bunch of stuff for us to cover here, so let's check it out. I'm going to get a file and choose New from Template. I'm going to grab an empty project and hit Choose. So here's my empty project. I get a choice of choosing whether I want a MIDI-based track or an audio-based track, or drummer, which is sort of a weird hybrid of both. I'm going to choose a software instrument and hit Create. All right, here's my software instrument. It brought up the default instrument, which is a classic electric piano. Now, maybe I don't want a classic electric piano every time I open up a new instrument in Logic. Well, what I can do is take the piano off of this track. So I'm going over to the inspector, which is showing me the information of this track, and I'm taking off the instrument, clicking and holding here and taking off the sends. And now I want to save this setting as default. So the first thing I have to do is I have to save it as a patch. So it's going to be a user patch. In the library in the lower right hand side, it's got save ... I'm going to name it default and hit save. Now I've done this once before, so that's why it's asking me to replace. It won't ask you to replace. So now I have an instrument called default. Now does that mean it's the default? No, not at all. Actually, I have to assign it. So in the lower left-hand corner of the library, I've got a little gear that says define as default. And there we go. Now every time I create a new software instrument, it says default, and there's no instrument laid into it. Now, we can also do things like enable patch merging. And what happens here is basically we decide what's going to be loaded up when we load a patch. So do we want sends, audio effects, instruments, MIDI effects? All of these things can be chosen or filtered out, depending on what our preferences are. Okay? So now I've got this default instrument. There's nothing on it. What do I want to do? Well, let's talk a little bit about how MIDI gets into Logic. So in Logic, we have something called the audio MIDI setup. I just hit Command Spacebar, which brought up my spotlight, and I did a search for the audio MIDI setup. Now I'm looking at the audio window, but what I want to do is actually look at the MIDI window. The MIDI window shows me all the potential of devices that I have hooked up to my computer or that I've had hooked up to my computer, and it gives me an idea of what can we receive MIDI from. So the IAC driver is an inter-applications bus. That means that we're sending MIDI from application to application. We've got network, which means that we can send MIDI through the air over a Wi-Fi network or over a LAN network. Then we have Axiom Pro 61, Pro 40, here's another 61, 49, 25. There are all of these keyboards that at some point, and audio interfaces, which at some point we're giving MIDI to my Logic sessions. When they're grayed out like this, that means they aren't going to be activated. When they're blue, that means they are active. So I've got an MPK Mini that's hooked up to my laptop right now, and it's giving me the ability to send MIDI notes and controller data into Logic. So this is where MIDI starts in our Apple system. We hook up a keyboard or an interface, an audio interface that has MIDI capability. And there's this thing called Core MIDI compliance. Most units that have a USB MIDI jack on them are Core MIDI compliant. And what's cool about that, it basically means if you hook this thing up to your computer, it just works. And that's the beautiful thing about Core MIDI. It's this beautiful way that we can just hook a MIDI device up to our computer and it just works. And that's awesome. So when you have active ports, you can also see those in Logic. I'm going to close out of the audio MIDI setup now, and in Logic, I'm going to go to Window, MIDI Environment. There's a layer in the MIDI environment. On the left-hand side here, I choose Layers, and I go to Click in Ports. This is where MIDI comes into Logic. So we saw how MIDI comes from the outside world into the Apple universe, and now we're seeing how MIDI is seen in Logic. So on the left-hand side, we have something called a physical input that's bringing the MIDI in, and I see that there's a contact program on my computer that's able to send MIDI to Logic, as well as the MPK Mini. Now there's a cable running out of that, and the cable runs into these two objects, and it eventually ends up at this thing called sequencer input. What sequencer input does is it takes the MIDI that came into the computer, and see this says some, so right now Logic sees any MIDI at all that comes into the computer, and it goes to the sequencer input. When it's tied to the sequencer input, and it always should be, that means that the MIDI is being sent to our tracks area. When it gets to the tracks area, that MIDI is going to, if this track is in record and we have an instrument there, even if we don't have an instrument on there, it will take the MIDI data in and record it onto this track. Now that the MIDI is printed on this track, it'll also play whatever instrument happens to be on this channel strip. And what happens at this point is the magic where MIDI gets converted from a control signal where you're just, you hit a keyboard and it says, send a C note, and it goes into the computer and it hits this point. And at this point, the instrument that you have, whatever instrument it happens to be, is going to take that note and convert it into audio. So it takes the note and it says, oh, I am a piano. I'm going to take that note and I'm going to convert it into a piano-like sound. And there you go. So now there's a piano, and now it's audio, and that audio can be sent into our mixer and mixed together with other pieces of audio, and we get our song. So that is the MIDI signal flow of how MIDI gets from the outside world into Logic. Next, let's talk about the different ways that we can process that MIDI on input.